Welcome to VBA Modeling for Supply Chain Planning and Financial Analysis. Here we will teach you how to write your own VBA code within Excel. This will be presented to you by Supply Chain Systems of Miami, Florida. Please contact us if you would like us to build models for you, or if you'd like to learn more about building the models for yourself. I hope you enjoy the tutorials, and please follow the link in the video description to get your own copy of the VBA code that is presented here. We had an introductory session before this, but this is the first lesson about the code itself. You'll notice on the screen what I've done here on the left side. We've actually already opened up the VBA code, and on the right side we have the normal Excel workbook with the multiple tabs on the bottom on the right side. Now this is what you will see when you actually click on the developer tab over here, then click on Visual Basic, and this window will pop up. And if you actually click on under modules, module 1, or if there's multiple modules, you'll actually start to see the code that's over here on the right of this particular panel. We don't need to see the Explorer part of this, so to give us a little bit more space on the screen, I'm just going to hit the X and close this part of that particular setting. So now we can actually just look at the code here over on the left side, and as we execute it, we can actually see what's happening to the spreadsheet on the right side. Alright, I want to make sure one thing is very clear at this point. The intent of these lessons is not to turn you into a programmer. We want to illustrate the potential to learn about this VBA code because it's very powerful, and it is going to allow you to automate your work. And if you do a lot of repetitive things, which I'm sure you do in most financial and supply chain type of jobs, you're doing the same analysis many times, and you want to automate as much of that as possible, and that will give you back a ton of time. I can actually see you collecting information, printing off reports, reformatting things, trying to plan and schedule different things. And if you do this manually versus an automated way, it's going to take you 2 to 3 times more time to do it manually than if you were to automate it. So once you learn how to program, it will almost become habitual with you that you'll try to automate as much as you can using the VBA code, and you'll become a much more powerful employee and as far as more professional in what kind of things that you're doing. You'll be spending much more time on the analysis part and a lot less time on the more grunt routine things that really does not have any value to it. Alright, so we're now looking at the code here, and I need to show you how to run the code. You have a couple buttons up over here on the ribbon. The first one is to run the entire subroutine. The next one is to pause it or to break it. And the next one is to either stop or reset the code. You can also get at some of these by clicking Run up at the top. You'll see just a repeat of those same buttons. In addition to that, under Debug, you'll have a couple more options. You can actually step into, which is the F8 key. Or if you want to run a block of code, you can actually do a Control F8, and you could put the cursor down lower, and then from the point where you are in the code already, it will run all the code between where you were to where you have your cursor. We'll talk about these breakpoints a little bit further on, and they are used for debugging and very similar to this last action of running to the cursor. Okay, so if you forget what those keys are that you use, you can always just click on Debug to find them again. And we're going to be using the F8 key very frequently here. So this is a key thing for you to remember on how to run the code. All right, next part. We need to look at the upper section of a program where we're going to define a lot of our global variables. But you'll notice that the first line here is option explicit. This line is added to force Excel to look at all the variables that you're using down in your program to make sure that you have declared them. You have said what type of a variable it is, and you're determining what kind of scope that those variables have throughout the program and the entire workbook. So up at the top here, if we're declaring things in this upper section here, we are declaring them globally. So they are not specific to the individual models. You'll see that we haven't even started into the modules yet. This is being declared at the very, very beginning, and that means these are very global variables. The first set here is normal variables. One is called string2 as a string and bflag1 as boolean. Strings are a combination of characters, words, phrases, numbers, but everything is treated as characters. In other words, you don't do any mathematics on it. You can concatenate things with strings, but you cannot do any mathematics on a string. The next one here is a Boolean type of variable. It's called bflag1 in this case. It's an arbitrary name I gave it. And it says as Boolean, which means that the final value that's put into this variable can either be a 0 or a 1. Those are the only two choices. The next four down here are illustrating that if you want to try to define to the program, the entire program, where to find your files, you can create some variable names and call them constant because these aren't going to change. We're going to give it, the first one here, the location of a file, which would be like a data file. And then the next part here, the FS name, would be where the data name is. Okay, what the name of that file is. And we would typically put the path together with the name, and that would be the access to that particular file. We also have a PB path and a PB name, and this is the path for the program that we're going to, in other words, this particular Excel file. And we'd also have the name of the actual program that we're going to be using. And this is a name that I had for another program that I have on here, and it's only for illustration purposes. But these are global variables, okay? And they will not change throughout all the different modules that we might create below. Going down to the next section, we have a, let's go look down over here. We see we're into a module already, and I'll describe the structure of the module here in just a minute. You'll see that we have some more variables are defined, but now I want to distinguish those from these up there, that these are local variables, and they will only be used, and the values in those variables will only be active during the time that this particular subroutine is being run. All right, the first one here is var1 as an integer being a number, okay, but usually you'll count with these numbers. They're used for counting very often. There are whole numbers, meaning that there are no decimal points, no fractions as part of the number, as opposed to a floating point number. And the second one, like above, we have a string 1 as a string, saying that we are going to put in some characters, words, or phrases into that particular variable. All right, let's look at the structure of a subroutine. Here we have sub, and if we scroll down to the bottom, the last line of any subroutine is going to have end sub. If you start to write your code and you start typing this in this format like this, it's going to add this last line to your code automatically. Or you can type it in yourself, either way. But this is the first line of all subroutines. It starts with sub, space, and then a name, followed by a set of parentheses. The parentheses would indicate whether you're passing values into the subroutine from another source. In this particular case, when there are none, you are still required to put the parentheses there, but we are not anticipating putting any values into the subroutine as some initial values. Alright, so this would be very typical of how a subroutine would be written. You'll note here that up above here, as well as at the end of some of these lines, we're putting in comments, and the comments are a single quote followed by whatever you want to write there. And you could put this either at the end of some code or on a separate line all by itself. And I use it very frequently to help to explain and even remember, what sections of code we're all about, how they operate. If there's something very special about it, I'll put in comments very frequently. But here again, we're looking at this particular subroutine, and just a word about what a subroutine is. A subroutine is a section of code that runs all by itself. Okay, it's independent of other code, but you can have multiple subroutines within a module. A module is just a collection of subroutines. Subroutines also can be called functions. Functions have they're dealing with values that are going to be passed in and out. Subroutines are very similar to that, except that they don't serve the purpose of having a very specific, isolated set of instructions and executions, as opposed to the functions. But they're very similar in nature and how they're written. Okay, we put our cursor somewhere on lesson 1. It doesn't really matter where you put it. If we were now to hit the F8 key, watch what happens. And if everything was set up right from like we talked about in the introduction, we had to enable the security to allow you to run the macros. And the macro, the first line that's going to try to run is the first statement. And it's recognizing that this is the start of this particular macro or subroutine. This word is used interchangeably. Macro is a holdover as a term from the old days of programming, where the programming was not in a language form. It was just a set of instructions on how to manipulate that particular program that you were using at the time, whether it be a spreadsheet like Lotus 123, Word, Outlook. It didn't matter what it was. Eventually, Microsoft adopted the VBA programming language as a replacement to a macro language. But the word macro is still a holdover from those earlier days. Anyway, we are moving along here and seeing that the yellow line here is indicating, number 1, that you are able to execute this macro. Number 2, this is the line that's going to be executed the next time that you hit the F8 key. So if we hit it one more time, watch what happens. It jumps over all of the comments, because those aren't going to be executed at all. And also the program, just by the sheer fact that you wrote it here, it's already checked these lines that are dimension statements. And those don't need to be executed again. So it jumped over all of those. And it indicates that the next line that's going to be executed is this line here. It says worksheets main.select. And right now on the workbook over here, you can see we're on the setup page, or the setup worksheet. Let's go ahead and execute and watch what happens here. It jumped and selected this particular worksheet, meaning that the focus of the Excel program has moved to that worksheet, and it actually selected that worksheet. which means that if you remember about Excel, you always select things. You select a set of cells, you select the worksheet before you do any execution on it. That is the normal routine. You always select before you do an operation. Alright, so in this case we selected the main sheet and we're going to do a clear statement on some set of cells. In this case, the range of those cells is column A to A, which means it's just column A. In other words, all of this. So if we come back over here and execute this with the F8 key again, bam, it erased everything in column A. And that means with that particular structure of that this command here, this is an indication that you're going to clear the formatting, any formulas, and any values that are in those particular cells. Now notice the next line here is very similar to the previous one, except we're going to move to a different worksheet. This one is called data. Instead of select, we're saying activate. So that means that we're not actually going in and saying that we're going to do something to it, but watch what happens when we hit the F8 key. It moves the cursor into that sheet, but it has not selected it. It's just a very subtle difference between the two. It's really not noticeable. You can almost use the commands interchangeably, but on a technical level, selecting means that you can now do an operation to it instead of just doing a moving the focus to it. In this particular case, we are now going to do an operation, and we're going to say clear, just like before, A to B. So let's go ahead and execute this particular line with the F key, F8 key, and you can see we expanded how much could be cleared. So it's just showing you the power of that. We went from one column, now we're doing two columns, and we're actually being very massive in how much information is being cleared at this time. The next one is just an improvement on that particular concept, but I'm being very selective now of which cells I want to clear. I'm saying only from C3 to C5, but it's everything in between. So that means C4 is also going to be cleared. So let's hit this one with the F8 key again, and you can see that it actually cleared 3 cells, C3, C4, and C5. The next line over here is a more massive situation, but we're actually able to do multiple commands where we had separate lines of code before, but we've combined it all into one line of code, and we've picked 2 different areas. But notice what happens here is that it's going to do everything from the top of this particular set of cells to the lower right hand corner of this set of cells. So when we execute this one, watch what happens. F8 again. Okay, now it did the operation, but you didn't see what happened to it. We did not move the focus. It did it in the background. So we didn't actually have to see it. We just wanted to have it done. So if we click to the main sheet now, you can see that it actually did erase everything from A1 all the way down to B11. And that's right here. So this entire section got erased. So it wasn't necessary for us to either select or activate it. We just had to say that this is the area that we wanted to do it to. Otherwise it wouldn't know what sheet to operate on. So we were able to do that. You would, if you were already had your focus there and you wanted to select some other cells to erase, you wouldn't have to indicate what sheet you were working on. You're going to assume it's already on the one that you've currently been working on. Alright, next, we don't have to do anything that's being displayed. We can be doing things in the background, in the memory of the computer, but not on the worksheet itself. So we're going to assign some values to these variables. var1 is going to be assigned the value of 5. Let's go ahead and execute that, and then execute the next one. And you'll notice that if we move our cursor over var1, you can see that it got assigned the value of 5. If we move our cursor down a little bit and move it over string 1, you can see that it was assigned the value of hello, this is lesson number 1. So once these lines are executed, you can actually hover over these particular variables and you should be able to see what value was assigned to it. Now if this was in actuality a formula which was calculated, it would show you the final result of that formula, not the individual parts of it. And that's what you'd want to see. You want to see the results. Alright, we're going to stop here, and we'll call this the end of lesson number 1 because we introduced a lot of things at the early part here. But we're going to basically continue in this first section on the next session. Thank you very much for watching, and hope you'll be back.